the second session, Building an Arts Institution in India. Abhishek Poddar from Bangalore, Dr. Deepika Sorabjee from Tata Trust, Pinakin Patel, and Dr. Kalyan Chakarbarty. So just as a brief introduction, clearly private arts institutions are rapidly being initiated across the subcontinent, a response partly due to the lack of government support, not only for the arts, but also arts education and skills training in general with regards to craft and other indigenous techniques. So we asked leading proponents of this new institution building movement, what are the core challenges they are facing and how do for-profit and non-profit arts organizations mediate with their socio-economic context? So we also examine how we can promote more professional working environments and innovative thinking through a variety of models and, very importantly, through locally sensitive approaches. So I'll be moderating this session. So we'll start with you, Dr. Chakravarty. You've been in the government public sector for most of your career. Quite unusually for a bureaucrat, you went off and studied in America to do your master's and PhD. And you came back to India. I met you in 2012, 2013 when you were the chairman of the Lalit Kala Academy in New Delhi. And I remember meeting you and sensing that things were afoot, government changed, and you found yourself unemployed. Going back to that period of the last government, you sensed there was a sense of optimism around public institutions in India. The National Museum had a new director. There were other things afoot. You were trying to revive the India Triennale. There were several projects and initiatives that you had spearheaded and started. Where are we today, and what was your experience back then with some of these national institutions?
Well, I moved into culture because I thought that it would be relatively unoccupied territory, but I found it was already preempted by various kinds of swindlers and duplicitous individuals. So, I mean, since I am also an administrator, I had to deal with it. So I had to deal with large-scale corruption even in culture, and uproot it. Sorry. And but then that didn't, stop me from being optimistic or making changes, because the changes we wrought, they remained and survived. That's, I think, so that others can speak. I mean, I am not pessimistic at all, because everywhere I worked, the change took place. Some of it was irreversible. Even by, in spite of all the corruption, it survived. The change survived. And with better days, things will turn around.
We find ourselves in a situation where it's largely left up to private individuals today. So I want to come to you, Abhishek. You are starting a new institution. There's plans afoot for a new institution in Bangalore. You come from the corporate sector, you have a commercial gallery, you have a foundation, and this is now finding genesis in an institution. What was the rationale? Why do you think it's important?
Well, I think, we've complained long enough of the government not doing enough. And I think it's for us to step up and fill in that void that we feel has been there. I mean, look at what happened in Kochi, for the example. So I think even what Richa has done here with Pinakin, so there are various such initiatives happening, and I think the time has come for it. It was just a dearth of such institutions that when we started looking at this, we felt there was such a need for it, and that's why we embarked upon it.
Yeah, Richa was going to be on this panel. I think Pinakin also, but she's in the audience. But Pinakin, when you first heard about this project and you were first invited, what was your initial thoughts, and what was, why this sort of hybrid space? What was the machinations of your imagination in terms of the possibility, given that you had the patronage of the cost, quite an important group in this state?
The premise here was just a tremendous opportunity more than any other structured offer. Because there was a patron in the Imami group, and they had a very innocent idea about saying that we want to give back to the city and we want to make an arts institution. What it will be, what it won't be, we don't know. And you take care of that, make the building as an architect and as an art collector or art aficionado. You see if you can spearhead this into some sort of a direction. And given that blank canvas, my first reaction was that over the years I have been friends with a lot of museum directors, a lot of gallerists, as well as artists. So I was trying to put each one's problems, strengths, weaknesses in balance and then arrive at what I should do over here. And say starting with the finest private museum in the country, which is the Calico Museum. And Gira has been a friend. And I could identify her crusade as a nationalist who wanted to preserve what otherwise would be lost in colonization. So I could see that. And it was such a well-envisioned effort that the Sorabjees had, in those days, taken permissions from the government to transfer funds into the UK and put them with investment bankers to make sure that every year there was a huge amount of money that came down to support the institution, publications, and yet everything seemed to fizzle out in one lifetime, in her own lifetime. So what was envisioned as something that would last generations, with market crashes, with inflation. So when I saw the vulnerability of that, on the other hand, in the West, most of my friends who were museum directors were spending more time trying to build up their collections, because they said that, that museum viewing had sort of become like shopping in a department store where people said that nothing new to show. So you had this constant pressure of building up collections. Now, in the previous century, at least, through philanthropy, through protecting your own culture, you had huge grants that kept coming into the museums. But today, with a digital economy and fluctuating sort of funding, I thought that I would request the corporation to fund a very nice building and then say that support us for the first 2 or 3 years where we falter and while we grow, but the rest of the time we must be able to sustain ourselves. Don't want to make profits because none of us know how to earn money, otherwise we wouldn't be doing this. But at least take care of the operational costs so that it becomes self-sustaining over a longer period of time.
Yeah, we'll come back to this question of funding because it does seem key across both the public sector and the private sector. But coming to you, Deepika, working at Tata Trust, and you talk about the previous century and the philanthropy of the Tatas, for instance, setting up some of the great institutions in this country. How is that? What's the backdrop to that? And we were discussing earlier, you've changed your criteria and some of the paradigms of assessment. So what are you really looking for now? Because you still are one of the largest public-private trusts in this country that is supporting the arts in a substantial way, in lieu of government support that's been well discussed.
I don't know where to start because it's got a very long history and I could talk for ages. But I joined the trust about 4 years ago, and we're celebrating the 125th year of the trust. And when I went looking for the archives to see what the pattern of funding was, because when I joined they were changing it, I couldn't find anything because there were no archives. And over the last 4 years we've set up the archives. It's a very small archive in terms of documents, in terms of what's there, because we only found documents sustained that they've kept since 2000. But the founder of the trust was a passionate collector of art. and simultaneously they were passionate about India gaining independence, and therefore the mandate of the trust was always towards a social commitment, what was happening in India. And among the various institutions, so initially the funds would go to private individuals, and you have a lot of illustrious people, even in the arts, who've had Tata Trust grants. And subsequently they moved into institutions because that is what they felt that was happening in India at that time. So from 1911 onwards they started, and you have the Institute of Science, TIFR, and various others, NIS in Bangalore, and NCPA is the one that they set up in the arts. But in the 80s, it switched from setting up institutions to funding, by then, what was growing, the non-governmental organizations or NGOs. And this is what has come out through the archives, a pattern of the changing way that they were funding. And then currently now, they've even revised that and said that they weren't getting the impact through the NGOs that they desired. Being one of the largest philanthropists in India, they found that community they weren't achieving what they wanted in community. So we were asked to actually go back, design programs, or design a way that we function as a notional institute. So we are not a brick and mortar, and that is where when you say art institution building, institutions are now changing. You have brick and mortar ones, you have this whole idea of the private sector coming in, and you also can do things, and we put our thinking caps on, and we have launched a program that we are doing, which is a national program, which even KCC is part of in conservation. So we're working with 5 institutions, trying to lay a basic infrastructure so that when we exit, you have one brick that anyone else can build on. And the question of sustainability that people keep telling, when you ask by your trustees saying, look for sustainability. And I always argue from 2 anecdotes that we pulled out from our archives, which I'll quickly share, is that it's only when you have sustained funding for any institution in the early years can you really make them sustainable. And so you can't say, we're going to give you a grant for 3 years, we're going to give you a grant for 6 years and pull out, because you're going to flounder. 2 institutions that we funded in 2001, one was Drupad Sansthan, which was run by the Gundecha brothers, and the other was Atakalari, which is a contemporary dance company. Today, and the reasons that you ask why we look at funding the institutions were both, it was an emerging art form, and this was an existing art form. Both needed support. One so that it was preserved, and one that would take shape in the cultural scene. And today, you have, nobody would say that Drupad is a drying art form. You have 25 practitioners in Drupad nationally and internationally from Tata Trust grants, fellowships, who are, and you set criteria on how you give it. They are teaching the next lot. So that whole pedagogical thing was built into the grant. And even with Atakalari, you have, you go to a graduation ceremony now and you have 30 or 40 kids from around the country. The mandate was not to stick to Bangalore, not to stick to the metros. They actually audition all over, and you see a growing form. The way we build institutions, when you say that we can't function, we've just instituted a master's in contemporary dance at Ambedkar University just to strengthen the sector. Because we felt that the practitioners were out there, how do we now get the critical overlay on that? And it's a practice-based master's at Ambedkar University. And I just come back right to set the thing in that health in India gets less than 1% of the budget. And when we look to the government and constantly say we need more money, you're not going to get more money. So you have to go out and work with them or start working from there and stop, you're not going to get anywhere if you keep on that track, as even Abhishek said.
Dr. Chakrabarty, this sounds like the role of government, but I mean, in the context of the last point, which I think is really important, when we're all looking to raise funds for culture, one has to understand that in a hierarchy of priorities in a developing country. Having said that, clearly culture can be looked at more holistically within governmental policy. But what was your experience? I mean, you really tried. I do remember you trying.
Well, you see, I have tried and I have, as I said, succeeded in many ways. Was as soon as because I have administered on a large scale, I was district magistrate even during the emergency and handled the you see, Naxalites also as chief electoral officer and all that. But then I always saw that the biggest problem with government policy is the gap between culture and development. All their strategies are culture independent. They're not culture specific, they're not eco-specific, they're not community specific. So everywhere I worked, I mean, whether it was in the district or in the national scene, so I tried to build the bridges. And that those bridges survived. In spite of all the damage the government did, those bridges survived. And then the second thing is that in all institutions which I headed, we supported the initiatives like the Tata Trust has been doing. We supported initiatives on a large scale. For in the IGRMS, the Manav Sangrahalaya, we immediately said that we shall shift from ex situ display to in situ revitalization. From, you see, the communities visiting the museum to museum visiting the communities. From collection of objects to recollection of ideas. So we read the charter, reread it, and then implemented it. There was a lot of furor in the national government, but they saw that there was no violation of the charter. So we left hundreds of initiatives without building, without creating anything on the ground. And many of those died, and along with the individuals, I mean, who created them, but many of them survived. And then this next thing is, you know, in the earlier session, this was suggested that how to get the audience. No, we did not try to get the audience. Now what would an urban audience do, I mean, looking at objects, you know, in the National Museum? We don't have the museum-going culture here. Nor would they, you see these huts in the Manav Sangrahalaya. But so what we did was to create initiatives and put them right in the midst of the people. In sync with the you see, rhythm of festivals, works, seasons, etc. So if there was a big festival going on, so we used to look at the entire rhythm, then locate the event there, and we used to get 5,000 people at a time, and they used to reinforce the initiative. As far as funding is concerned, we used to spend about 10%. They used to spend 90%. I mean, in a new museum movement, I mean, at 9,000 feet above the sea level, we invited people. So 79 villages with 5,000 people gathered on their own money. They looked after themselves. We just created a small spectacle for 3 days that culminated in a museum which has been created in, you know, Uttarakhand. And there are many such things. So I'm just giving an illustration of how they strategizing funding. Our job is not to fund the entire thing, but to incite the initiative. So that is, it was a catalytic role. And then thirdly, you know, we used to, because the government, I mean, in fact, I always say that the Secretary Culture should be renamed as an event manager, national event manager. All they do is to manage events. I mean, so they have no time for, you see, the substance of it. They don't understand culture, mostly illiterates. So they cannot, you see, except creating events, they don't know anything. Because a spectacle to be inaugurated by the high and mighty, nothing more. That's all they do. But since that is all they do, and I have to be in the system, so I used to take advantage of it. I mean, the preparing for the event, so much work used to be done on the ground. So, and then so much deposit used to be left. The event used to be there, and the event used to be great and large. But, I mean, a lot of work was done. And finally, you know, you see, so far as apart from this line of list resistance, we used to reinvent the cognitive categories. For instance, exhibition. I mean, in situ regeneration rather than ex situ display. So we took around a Sacred Grove exhibition. Now, Professor K.C. Marutu would ask me that let us have a Sacred Grove book. I said, what is the point in having a book? Let the book be an outcome of an entire initiative. So we had a Sacred Grove festival. We invited, you know, communities from all over the country, and they created around 200 acres. All kinds of things they did. Then the Sacred Grove would be taken, the exhibition, to, let us say, Birajpet Taluk in Kurg. And there, out of 350 temple committees, you would see 50 were functioning. Then they would say, oh, I mean, why have you come all this way? Is it that important? Then we should also do something about our sacred groves. Let us revive them. So to assist. It is this catalytic role which we expanded, which did work.
Coming to you, Pinakin Bhai, you know, before this, you created the Dashrath Patel Museum in Alibag. And in a way, it was a sort of precursor to this project, but a very different project. You call him a mentor. There was an exhibition here, the inaugural exhibition. Do you want to talk about some of that experience of setting up that museum and how that has impacted your thinking in terms of setting this up, or the two completely unrelated projects?
Yeah, though that was driven more emotionally and more singularly as a developing relationship between the guru and his shishya. I think the foundation of it was the same, which is to say that but that's the time I learned that unless the individual or privately, if you don't sort of crusade for what you believe in, then there is no state as yet. I think we're also a very young nation. We are only 70 years old. So when we compare ourselves in philanthropy and culture, we are comparing ourselves with countries that have been who they are for 200 years, 500 years, if not thousands of years. So Dashrath Patel, for example, I thought was India's Renaissance man and not remembered in any one particular field, because every 10 years he kept jumping into a new discipline, which today would have earned a lot of interest from all over to say that, how can you be so multidisciplined? But in those days, each discipline kind of forgot him and said, okay, he's not a painter, he's an educationalist and he's a designer and he's into social work. So at a time like that, I thought that the easiest thing would be to go and offer his works and his legacy to existing institutions. But I guess, the economy was such 10 years ago that not many existing institutions had the funding to even take in so much of a free sort of estate. And therefore I thought that wherever land was cheap, and Alibag was just on the outskirts of Mumbai, and I said that, if we build our own little museum and just hold on to it, it will then have another lease of life, which could be its ultimate destination. So when we did that, and when it generated a lot of global interest, and Sir Nick Sarota came from the Tate to see it, and he said that, why isn't this museum more known about? Why isn't it more publicized? It's so qualitative. And I said that this is the first generation. This is the first attempt to preserve something modern that we have. And in a karmic way, in a Hindu philosophical way, I said perhaps my destiny was only to bring it to this stage. And now I've just put the foundation that others will take it over and make it famous and make it spread and things like that. So I personally don't view institution building as a single generation thing.
I think that comes to you now, Abhishek. You're embarking on a project. What's going through your mind? What is the vision for this? Has it been articulated? I know that you're appointing advisors and trustees, and you're going through the motions. But where do you see this going? And do you agree with what Pinakin just said?
I embarked on this again very emotionally, and frankly speaking, I didn't even know who to go to, because nobody had really done what we are trying to do over here, and we have no clue what we are trying to do. So I said, let me go to the people who know that particular sector best, and we're very fortunate that whoever we've approached has come forward to help, whether it be, experts like Anupam here through the Tatars as far as restoration is concerned, whether it be about folk and tribal art or contemporary painting. We have 4 different directors of museums on our advisory panel. We have a tax expert, a funding expert, somebody who as a corporate does the maximum for the arts, another who raises the maximum amount of money, because we are zero in every department. So we need to get the best advice from people who really know what they're doing and learn from them. We didn't find a single person here who had started a museum except for Pinakin, what he's done with Dashrath Bhai's work, or a Kiran Nadar, but they are much smaller in scope than what we are trying to envisage. So we wanted this to encompass many of the things that they've done and a lot others.
Deepika, what's your experience now going into these quite disparate, diverse organizations, individuals, perhaps collectives, archives, different kinds of entities? What are you looking for in terms of, is it expertise? Are you looking for reliability, due diligence?
We mainly look at what the gaps in the sector are, where there is no funding going. And the three words we work in the portfolio is what's marginalized, what's with multiplicity, and with excellence. And with marginalized, I don't mean just in terms of caste or economic. It's gender, it's region, it's economic. It's a multiple range of what just access to something could be a marginalization. And therefore, our programs that we fund are very varied. And they're mostly, we don't look at metro cities, largely look at communities, because we find that however hard it is to fundraise in a metro city, it is 100 times harder for someone sitting out who's a wonderful singer, a wonderful craftsman, a wonderful artist, and they're not going to get it. So those are the basic things that we work with. But being an arts portfolio, we are not an arts foundation. So I have to argue as probably, fight for as hard as, say, Dr. Chakrabarty had for funding within my organization. And it's the stress that we put on in the portfolio is that whatever we do, it has to be with excellence. Because it's like medicine, it's like other things that with art forms, if you're not doing it with excellence, then, and you're only looking at income and livelihood, then it becomes livelihood and at the cost of a craft or an art form. So those are roughly the guidelines, but it's mainly in the gap sector where there's no funding going that we look at things, or there's no infrastructure. Largely now we're looking. So we support the Students' Biennale because of the state of education in the art schools in India were a concern. Everything that was happening in contemporary art, and there are two institutions here dealing with that, was happening outside of the colleges, after the students graduated. And why is it? It was happening, but why couldn't you bring that into, the colleges that were outside the contemporary art radar, which otherwise a lot of students who were talented would miss that. Some would break out, come to a metro city and be able to make it, but a lot of other talent would go missing. And these are the criteria that we do. But I feel that we are dealing in very different times. You talked about going and sitting with Keku and Khorshid and having long chats. I think that era is gone. I don't think our younger generation is willing or has the time. Times have changed. And therefore, you see newer art forms emerging. Just take music. If you EDM, there's no outlet for it. Where is the museum for it? Where is, is a Sangeet Kala Academy going to allow that in? No. So you're seeing institution building through festivals. So you have a magnetic field that comes year after year, but it has a dedicated audience, it has its own culture that's brewing, and it's the way things have happened in India organically. And I think the time has come now, as is happening, that if you want to scale up, it is only through collaboration. Collaboration with government or private institutions collaborating with each other, say private galleries in Bombay, like Mumbai Gallery Weekend. It's a small beginning, but it could become in 10 years' time an institution which is de facto in contemporary art in Bombay, just as Kochi has become and it's also, I think what's happening is that you're having a lot more different kinds of professionals coming out in the art world. Just take contemporary art. When you were sitting with Keku and Khorshid, there were no critics. There were hardly any critics. There were hardly any curators. There were hardly any archivists. Today, young kids are graduating maybe abroad because we don't have the instruction here, but they're coming here and there are no jobs. And that's causing huge discontent. And how do you address that? Tina. Yeah.
Send them to her.
No, that's a very good point. Would anybody like to respond on the panel or in the audience? On this point or any of the points that have been raised?
See, human resource is of the utmost importance. The human resource exists. Most of the initiatives I put on the ground, for instance, I created this Ujjain Palace Museum at the Royal Palace in Tripura at the request of the communist government. The BJP government has not been able to give up the initiative, so they are continuing. So there we use the local artists. We just gave, again, some, you see, infrastructural support, created, the design support, etc. But the museum was created by local people. Similarly, I created a Purkhauti Muktangan in Raipur when he went there as additional chief secretary, 300 acre. So they gave a concept and then invited the artists to make the museum. They said, we don't make museums. You tell us the idea, you give the design. We said, no, you create it. Now, what do? You create an honors gate. We have never created an honors gate. So create one. Use your existing art in permutations and combinations. They did it. They did it wonderfully at very low cost. And similarly, all over the country, I have found the human resource exists, but it has to be, assisted, promoted. For instance, museums. There are about 3,000 museums in the country. All of them are languishing. They are not published. They don't have conservation. They don't have guidance. So as National Museum Director General, I used to have meetings all over the country. They were happy. They didn't want assistance. They wanted a kind of a catalytic support for conservation, for publication, and for, I also requested the INTAC to do it, but they were not interested. So what I'm saying is that with catalytic support, the human resource which already exists in the country can be harvested and replenished.
Any questions? Okay, let's move on now to this question of funding, because I think that seems to be the key sort of challenge, if you like. Now, you have been able to, you're beginning to raise money. You've also done things with your collection in order to raise money. Here in this case, you have a corporate group, and you're arguing that money is not the principal thing. So where do we, what is the principal challenge if it's not funding? And if it is funding, why do you think it is the principal challenge?
Well, I think you need money to do anything to start with. Once you get enough momentum around something, I think it's easy for money to start flowing in once the interest is there. Also, people like to see something on the ground that gives them the confidence that this is something worth supporting and it's going to be sustainable. The project that we undertook was earlier a joint venture with the government, where it was a very small budget and it was going to happen in an existing institution that the government had. And when things didn't go very well with that, we decided to do it on our own. The budget was about 7 times or 8 times that. Now, we didn't have that money. We did a sale of some part of the collection at Christie's to raise the money to do so. And the family decided to give 50 crores for this project. And the other 50 came from corporate patrons. And this is not making an investment as a VC fund where you're going to get a return. You're only going to get your status as a founding patron, and you get return in terms of that you've done something good for the community or for the industry. We started with that. Today, I'm happy to say that there is a far greater response than we had imagined. We've started getting collections as gifts. Collections from people I've met for the first time in my life when they've come to give us that collection. I think people are beginning to see, the family itself gave half the collection as a gift to the foundation. We didn't do it in the company, we didn't do it in an individual name, nothing was given on lease. It was all done in the foundation, because nobody, even a generation down can change anything. It's already been done that way. So I think motives are what people look for, and we've had patrons like Citibank, like Tata Trust, the Munjals, Kiran Mazumdar, Fidelity, all the Bangalore IT companies, they've all come forward to help because it's the first such initiative which is happening. So I'm not saying that it is easy to do. I think Deepika jokes, she sends people who come to ask her for funds, go and ask Abhishek how to fundraise. And I said, you know, she's saying, maybe we should hire you as our fundraiser.
Richa, I know that you sort of stood aside, but we had an interesting conversation some time ago, and you were quite emphatic that you didn't want to go out raising money for this necessarily, and this was not what you wanted to end up doing as the director of this space, but that you wanted to create a hybrid institution that then self-funded itself. Can you explain why you felt that was important, not keep going back to the corporate mothership and asking for more and more grants?
It's actually sometimes a little difficult to get grants from different corporates. We have to go back to them with any number of papers. Sometimes we're not able to actually explain what we want to do because there's always a first of everything. Once you set an example, then people are okay to come and be a part of something that you've already done. So even at this building, what we try to do is create one commercial space, the gallery, which would actually fund all the activities of the building. Like Pinakin uncle earlier also said, at least we should be able to run the basic institution and then wait for it to grow organically so that people who believe in what you are doing or like-minded people come together and grow together rather than wanting to say, I funded this and so what is it that I'm getting back in return? Because I think we're still very young in this field. So people are always looking for what they can get back in return. I'd rather work in a way where we have freedom of thought and freedom to also change where direction requires. And then it's so important to have people who are on the same page to be working with you because it's easier to communicate. It's easier to build an institution which is something which our company in totality, we started with a lot of passion. So we don't want that to get diluted anywhere.
May I respond to that? We've had patrons come to us asking all kinds of funny things. We've told them to keep their money. We don't want it. If they believe in what we are doing, only then we want them to support us. And I think it's very important to articulate what you want to do and live by that. And of course, I mean, both City and Tatas, they said that, listen, our due diligence is so bloody strict that you're going to be sorry you even came to us. I said, try me if you find it worthwhile, and if you found everything fine, only then support it. And the good thing that's happened is when others come, they say, oh, you've passed the Tata test and the City test, then we don't need to do a due diligence. So I think partly you need to have clarity on what you want to do, and then people come forward and support it if they believe in that, not otherwise.
We also passed the Tata test.
No, I just want to comment here that just from all these reactions, it's obvious that you don't look for one funding model. There's several. In a country like ours, you're never going to get funding easily from the public sector. So I think what's happened, and it's very important for institutions like this and what Abhishek is doing in Bangalore, is it's going to break that suspicion about the corporate world. Because there is a suspicion within the art world about the corporate world, about funding some kind of committee art or some kind of their private collection, or they have an agenda. And I think if you can put your intent across clearly, if you can and be asked very, very strict questions about, because they're coming with backgrounds where they have been something else in the art world before, and now they're changing. So if you know that, then and you can work with that, I think it's important to work with that because otherwise funding, as I said once when I was speaking to some function that Abhishek had, is how often do you hear of a public art museum come up in our country?
Just want to interject there. I mean, you mentioned a very interesting figure. You said there are 3,000 museums or so. I don't know where the sources of that data, or as you mentioned, there's not a directory, there's not a website. But
no, there are books, but then I have moved all over and invited people for meetings. I mean, these are public purpose museums built by individuals. I mean, some of them are built by universities. Some of them are specialized museums built by scientific institutions. Some of them are, languishing because the individual who created them has died. But they're outstanding collections of all kinds. I mean, fossils and this and that. I mean, one can't imagine the wealth, I mean, which is lying around. And as Abhishek was talking, that, people are ready to give the money. But here, we are talking about hinterland again. I mean, where the collection has been done locally. And because let us say the ASI has 3,600 monuments under protection. The state government between them has about, 20,000. And then the country has 1 million monuments and sites. Inside the forest, I mean, there are thousands of rock art sites which are dying every day. So I initiated a movement. I mean, I can't tell them to give the money for protection of rock art sites, which are older than anything here, 40,000 years old, 100,000 years old. And all of them are dying. And they're being destroyed by mining, this and that. So I introduced a biocultural diversity project and moved all over. I mean, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, etc. And asked them to protect it. All that is needed is to train the forest people in, protection. Now the government is, most of the government, because government is a kind of a entity without hands, legs, ears, and it is not an organic entity. It is just a collection of individuals, I mean, dragging different directions. So I try to attract individual interest and get them involved in the protection. I mean, now that I'm outside government.
So we're talking about, one of the things is sustainability, right? So one of the criticisms of private institutions as opposed to, let's say, in the Western mold of the state institution is that once the founder's vision, diminishes for whatever reason, that these institutions don't last very long afterwards. And so how would you build in, I mean, is this something that you think about when you're creating an institution? Is it, does it have a lifespan? Are you thinking 20 years, 50 years, or are you thinking 200 years? Or does that even come into it?
This isn't something that we had really thought about very seriously because, frankly speaking, if one knew what one was doing, I'm not sure I would have embarked on this project to start with. But it was we set up a foundation in the US as well. And it was at a board meeting over there in New York, and they said, okay, you build this museum or you'll build it. How are you going to run it? And we said, well, this is what it's going to cost us, and we'll raise the money every year and run it. And they said, what happens after you? So I said, after me, it's your problem because I'm dead and gone. So you are the board. They said, but what happens if a truck comes and hits you tomorrow? So I said, so what do you want me to do? So they said, we need an endowment in place, which is now what we are working towards, that we don't have to go and ask anybody anything tomorrow. So, of course, like Pinakin also mentioned that Giraben had looked at an endowment when they started, but how the world changes, one cannot anticipate. You can only plan things at the best of your information and knowledge that you have and what is available to you at that point to look at what rate of return you would get, what kind of instruments you can invest in. But one has to start somewhere. If we had every answer, we don't even know what the problems are going to be. We can only look at how far we can anticipate and plan for that. And yes, we are planning for that.
You see, sustainability depends on relevance. You see, we are talking about relevance in the 21st century. Now, we are talking about, thousands of communities all over the country. It has to be relevant to their life needs. So that's why I'm always talking about the nexus between culture and development. All human and natural resource managements of communities are rooted and shored up by arts. And therefore, whether it is medicine and food chain, or whether it is, soil management or forest management, there is this nexus. So if one builds on that foundation, then the people own it. I mean, as soon as one tries to have it owned by, you see, as I said, fraudulent people, I mean, who only look for the main chance, how to earn from it, it's not possible to, or one looks for dedicated individuals like Abhishek, I mean, who will be there forever. It's not possible to guarantee that succession. So it has to be rooted in relevance to, the culture and development nexus.
So in a country as diverse as India, it's really, I mean, this idea of the nation state is also contested. I mean, it's really a kind of a hybrid, you know, there's so many, extremely diverse, I would say, for any nation state in the world. It's probably one of the most diverse linguistically, culturally, historically, etc. So the local socio-economic context and a local approach, how important is that? And it seems that when we import models generally from the West, that some of that nuance of what is important in our local communities, what's important to a local audience is somehow lost. Would you agree with that?
What is lost?
The local sensitivity.
Well, I don't think the local sensitivity is lost, because you have the most passionate individuals out in who start things without thinking it through. Now, you have a different model in Abhishek, where he's thinking everything through before he starts the museum. But there's a museum in Manipal, and I think Sudarshan also knows him, started by Vijayanath Shenoy. He was a bank clerk, and it was just pure passion. When he started what he thought was disappearing in the old houses that were being uprooted in Karnataka in development. And today, it's a fantastic museum, and because the integrity of the man was so sound that he's got people donate them. The whole Ravi Varma studio is there. He's got magnificent Tanjore paintings. But it's a model that should be studied because of the problems it's created. Very often museums are started by highly individualistic people in the local context who are very passionate. And therefore, they do not allow anyone in. Now, I hope all these institutions, even though they're being started by particular families or corporates, that they do have a professionalized kind of committee, a board running the museum with professional people in place there are curators, there are a proper archivist, everything that's in place, so that it's not dependent on one person. Now, what he achieved at Hastshilpa, nobody else could have achieved, because his vision was so fantastic, and it's preserved a particular point of time. I think it's a very different kind of museum, and so you have to celebrate that, but you also have to look at the problems that the trust identified a lot of organizations that we were funding at one point and said that we are worried about the succession. And this is, what will happen to this project, because they're so solely rooted in one person. And so we asked Hastshilpa to send someone to Bangalore for the workshop. And they struggled. And then finally, Harish went. But that is what you have to address, that while you let that passion run through, you have to think beyond yourself. When you go, what will happen to the institution?
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time. If we're not out of time, we can probably take a question if there's a question. Yes, Anupam?
This is with reference to whether it is funding or what is it that an institution life will grow into. I think there are two aspects. One is the capital aspects, the capital aspect of an institution. So for that, often funding or even recognition comes as en bloc. There's a certain tranche of resources that come into play. But beyond that, if you're looking not only at the life of the institution, but where will the rest of the funding come from for running it, that comes purely from your activities that you've planned. And unless you have that range of activities built into your program at the time of establishment, at least tentatively, you will have to keep approaching somebody for funding. But once your activities are scheduled, it is that which not only creates audiences, it creates relevance, it creates funding opportunities, it forward links to so many other sectors eventually. So I think that is something that cannot be discounted.
It's a very good point. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll move straight on to the next session before going to tea after that. Banda Taveri and Swarup Datta. Thank you.